When we talk about blood flow and through the cardiovascular system, we should talk about the flow rate and the flow velocity. And these two things are not the same thing. Our flow rate is the volume of blood that passes a given unit per time. So, volume of blood passing a specific point per unit of time. Right? So, if we look at a blood vessel like a tube, right, our rate is going to be how much blood passes that unit or passes this specific point per unit of time. So we know that our flow is proportional to the change in pressure from the inlet pressure and our outlet pressure, right? But our flow is inversely proportional to the resistance. So the resistance is the opposing force to the flow. And a scientist by the name of Poseel determined that resistance was equal to 8 times the length of the tube times eta, which is the viscosity of the fluid, divided by pi r cubed, which is r is the radius. So as we increase the length of the tube, that's going to increase our resistance because the fluid is going to bounce off of these walls a little bit more. As we increase the viscosity of the fluid, that's going to increase fluid. Think of water flowing through a tube versus maple syrup flowing through a tube. And then as we change the size of the tube, right, it's going to increase resistance because the fluid is going to hit those walls a lot more, right? So you're going to get more resistance. So if we combine this, then what we can say is that our flow is proportional to the change of pressure all over our resistance, right? And so that will impact our sort of flow rate, right? So how much blood is passing a given point per unit of time. Now, that is different than the velocity. The velocity is the distance a given volume of blood travels per unit of time. Okay? And our velocity is determined by the flow rate over the cross-sectional area of what it's flowing through. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit differently. Right? Imagine that we have a single lane road and we're going to measure sort of this point right here, right? And we put 3 cars on our road, right? And we can say that our flow rate or the rate of traffic is equal to 3 cars per second. Okay, so 3 cars per second, meaning that these 3 cars will pass this point in 1 second, right? So that is our flow rate. And let's just say that the velocity of each car is, we'll just say 50 feet per second. Okay, so notice this is how far they travel per unit of time. This is how much travels past a point per unit of time. Now, what happens if I take my road and now all of a sudden I make my road a 3-lane road, and I'm going to look at this specific point here. Now, what happens if I take my 3 cars and I put them in the 3 different lanes? Okay, and what if I put more cars back here? Like so. Now, if we did so and we kept our velocity the same, right? Velocity is the same. So if our velocity is equal to 50 feet per second, okay? Our rate, right? Because we can get 3 deep, essentially. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? On all 3 lanes. So now all of a sudden my rate is 9 cars per second. Okay? So if I want to keep my flow rate the same, right? If I want my flow rate to be, what happens if I want the rate to stay the same as the first, which was 3 cars per second? But I still have my 3-lane highway. But this time, going past this point, I only want 3 cars per second. What do I have to do? I have to decrease my velocity by 1/3. So this means that now each car is traveling 16.66 repeating feet per second. Okay, so notice that if I sort of zoom out here and we can see all 3 of them, right? The rate here is the same as the rate up here, but the velocity here is lower than my velocity here, right? And it's because it is the cross-sectional area that determines the overall velocity, right? And so that matters when we look at blood flow through the vessels, because if we look, the cross-sectional area of capillaries is much greater than what it is for the arterioles, right? So I got my arterial, and we can sort of divide this into, let's say this is just a capillary bed that I'm making here. Very simplistic, like so, right? So what happens is the flow rate here in the arterial, right? We'll call this rate 1, has to equal rate 2, right? Why does rate 1 need to equal rate 2? What if rate 2 was smaller than what it was in rate 1? We'd get a back pool of blood here. So the rate moving through needs to be the same, right? But if I look, what if my area, cross-sectional area here is 1, right? But over here, each one of these, my cross-sectional area is 1. Now my total cross-sectional area is 3, right? This is the same as my 1-lane highway splitting into my 3-way highway. So what happens to my velocity when it hits this area? The velocity through each one of these tubes, right, through each one of the lanes, each one of the cars, right, is going to go down. So by increasing that cross-sectional area in the capillaries, we can keep the rate the same. So we're going to say the rate in the capillaries is equal to rate in arteries. That's important, right? So that we don't get a backflow of the blood, right? But the velocity in the capillaries is much lower. And it's much lower, and that's important because now the blood slows down as it moves through these capillaries, and because it slows down, it allows time for exchange, which is what needs to happen at those capillaries, right? So our rate remains the same, but velocity decreases inside of those capillaries. So that's very key component in understanding blood flow through the circulatory system.